The Cuban population had 2% growth in 1960 to 0% growth in 2010 and is currently negative 0.14% growth. To calculate this, you subtract the death rate from the birth rate. The population of Cuba will double in 102 years, and the U.S. will double in 116 years. This is determined by the fertility rate. There is a large gap between birth rates and death rates between the years 1950 and 1975. To find the birth/death rates, you must take the number of births/deaths divided by the total population multiplied by 1,000. The birth rate in Cuba is 9.5, while the death rate is 8.5. In the U.S., the birth rate is 13.4, and the death rate is 8.15. If the birth rate is higher than the death rate, then there will be population growth. The historical fertility rate of Cuba in 1964 peaked at almost 5 children per woman. Now it has lowered to 1 to 1.5 children per woman. In 1964, the U.S.'s fertility rate was 3.19 births per woman, and now the U.S.'s fertility rate is 1.88 births per woman. Cuba's infant mortality rate has decreased from 20 deaths per 1,000 births in 1980 to less than 10 in 2006, whereas the U.S. went from less than 20 in 1980 to less than 10 in 2006. The life expectancy in Cuba and the U.S. was mid-70s in 1990 and up to almost 80 this year. The projected infant mortality rate should be lowered by a bit every year. The life expectancy rate should be raised by a bit each year. The first age structure diagram in 1959 shows the majority of the population is young, and the older the age, the less amount of people there are. With the age structure population in 2016, you can see the large majority of the population is between the ages of 40 and 50. The projected graph shows the largest age group would be 60 to 64, upper and middle-aged. The Cuban net migration rate is negative 3.64 migrants per 1,000 population. Due to the Castro Revolution in 1959, Cuban population in the U.S. rose from 71,000 to 163,000. Today, there are about 1,144,000 Cuban immigrants in the U.S. Along with many others seeking refuge from Fidel Castro and his dictatorial government, my grandparents, aunts, uncles, and many extended family arrived in Florida in 1960. Florida is full of Cubans who emigrated from Cuba around this time. Although only a small percentage of the population left during this time period, this emigration and isolation has led to detriment socially, economically, and politically. Tuberculosis became controlled after 1959. The Cuban government implemented chemotherapy at the primary level to treat the disease. Before 1962, Cuba's national immunization program did not exist. Now it is highly unlikely for someone to get mumps because of the vaccine. In future years, both of these diseases should be getting more treatment through economic and medical advancements. In 2006, the population of Cuba was approximately 11,275,000. In 2016, the population is about 11,392,000. In order to find out the average annual growth rate over the last 10 years, we subtracted the past population from the current population, divided by the past population, and multiplied by 1,000. The population growth over the past 10 years has been about 1.04%. Based on this estimation of population growth, we can estimate that the population for 2026 will be about 11,510,000. Since Cuba has a very low rate of children per woman, population momentum is not a large contributing factor. Cuba is currently in the fourth stage of demographic transition, meaning that both birth and death rates are low, which leads to a stable population. The low birth rate also indicates the improvements in Cuba regarding equality, birth control, and the greater importance placed on things other than having children. Along with these factors, another factor contributing to lowering birth rates is the growing literacy rate among the entire population, but specifically women. The literacy rate has increased from about 56% in 1953 to almost 100% today. Historically, there was a disparity between male literacy and female, but today females are just as literate as men. If it weren't for birth control, importance of other things than having children, such as careers, high literacy rates, and many other factors, the population of Cuba would be growing by much more and much faster. These factors all contribute to the population not growing by much because some people aren't having children until very late and others aren't having children at all. In developing countries, an increase in economic growth leads to a higher GDP and a lower unemployment rate. A low unemployment rate leads to lower death rates, which contributes to a more stable population. The Cuban unemployment rate is currently at 2.7% in comparison to the U.S., which is 5.5%. Compared to other countries, even other developing countries, Cuba consumes very little energy. Cuba, along with all other light yellow countries on this map, shows an average consumption of about 25 to 74 BTUs, which is about 8 gallons of gasoline, used annually per person. Most developed countries show 250 to 400 plus BTUs per person annually. Developing countries also have a much smaller ecological footprint than most developed countries. For example, the Cuban footprint is 1.8 global hectares per person, while the United States footprint is 8 global hectares per person. Even with their small ecological footprint, Cuba still maintains an ecological deficit, meaning that they are consuming more energy than their environment can sustain for a long time. The IPAD equation suggests that the environmental impact is calculated by multiplying population, affluence, and technology. This equation determines the sustainability of the path that the country is on environmentally. Since Cuba recently stopped its isolation policy, there is now a new possibility of Cubans to obtain the new technology of developed countries, leading to more affluent lifestyles and a more sustainable path. Cuba implemented a reforestation program in 1998 that is aiming for 29% of the land to be covered with trees. The negative side of this is that there is less land for cultivating crops and chopping the trees down for resources. On the other hand, there are more trees to stop pollution, keep their water clean, and prevent sea levels from rising and wiping out towns. The people living there would have to find new ways and resources to use instead of trees. In the long run, their forests are helping them conserve their resources and soil for better agriculture. The government just needs to make sure they enforce the environmental laws, and then Cuba will be on the right path. In 2015, after 54 years of a Cuban embargo with the United States, America has finally ended the isolation with Cuba, and Cuba is now allowing new technology in. Although this policy change has brought about many strong opinions from some Cuban Americans since Castro is still in power, this change will lead to new technological development and improve Cuba's economy.